For a German soldier on the Eastern Front, death was a constant companion. It was in the shriek of incoming artillery, in the gnawing hunger of a broken supply line, and in the merciless Russian winter. It was a known quantity, a grim reality of every waking moment. But there was another kind of fear, a fear of a name that meant you weren't just going to die, you were going to be erased. That name was Zhukov. This isn't just the story of one general. It's the story of how a man became a psychological weapon. It's about how whispers in the trenches, chilling reports from shattered units, and even Germany's own propaganda combined to create a specter that haunted the Wehrmacht. The German Lanzer faced many Soviet marshals, but none carried the same weight of dread. Other generals might defeat you. Zhukov, it was believed, would annihilate you. He represented a different kind of warring, personal, mathematical, and absolute. It was a war of numbers, of overwhelming mass, of an iron will that would pay any price in blood and steel. To the men in German gray, this wasn't warfare as they knew it. It was an oncoming apocalypse, and Zhukov was its harbinger. This is the story of the myth and the man. We'll explore how Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, a peasant's son turned marshal of the Soviet Union, became one of the most terrifying figures in the minds of his opponents. We'll look at the brutal reality of his tactics, the way German intelligence and propaganda accidentally built his legend, and the accounts of the soldiers who saw his armies looming over the horizon. This is the story of how a name became a synonym for annihilation on the most brutal front in human history. To understand the fear Zhukov inspired, you first have to understand the man. He wasn't born into a military family. He was born into poverty in 1896 in the small village of Strelkovka, a world of mud and hardship that defined pre-revolutionary Russia. His formal education was brief, and his first job was as a furrier's apprentice in Moscow. The crucible that forged Zhukov wasn't a fancy academy, but the trenches of World War I, conscripted into the Imperial Russian Army in 1915. He served as a cavalryman in a dragoon regiment, a role that would shape his thinking for decades. He was decorated twice with the Cross of St. George for bravery and suffered serious concussions from mine explosions, learning the savage realities of combat firsthand. When the Russian Empire fell, Zhukov joined the Bolsheviks and their new Red Army during the chaos of the Russian Civil War. He honed his instincts for command. It was here he began to show the traits that would become his hallmark: an obsession with discipline, a sharp eye for detail, and a temper that could terrify subordinates into action. He wasn't a man of grand theories. His language was force, and his only metric for success was absolute victory, no matter the cost. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Zhukov became an effective practitioner of the new Soviet doctrine of deep battle, understanding earlier than many of his peers that the future of war lay in steel, speed, and shock. While theorists like Tukhachevsky were writing the playbook, Zhukov was learning how to execute it, commanding cavalry and later large mechanized corps. This reputation as a tough, competent, and non-political commander may have saved his life. When Stalin's Great Purge ripped through the Red Army, resulting in the arrest or dismissal of tens of thousands of officers and the execution of several thousand, Zhukov survived. The world first got a real taste of Zhukov's methods, not in Europe, but on the plains of the Mongolian border in 1939 at the battles of Khalkhin Gol. The Japanese Kwantung Army tested Soviet resolve with a major incursion. Stalin sent Zhukov to take over. What happened next was the Zhukov blueprint. He built up an overwhelming superiority in tanks and artillery, all while conducting deceptive operations to lull the Japanese into a false sense of security. Then he unleashed a devastating surprise attack. He didn't just push the Japanese back. He executed a massive double envelopment, trapping and crushing a huge portion of the Japanese Sixth Army. The victory was so decisive that it played a major role in convincing Tokyo to abandon its ambitions of expanding into Siberia and turn its focus south. Khalkhin Gol established the Zhukov method: meticulous planning, overwhelming force at a single point, tactical deception, and a final, decisive blow aimed at total destruction. He returned to Moscow a hero. Stalin, a man who trusted no one, saw in Zhukov a powerful tool. In January 1941, just months before the German invasion, Stalin made him chief of the General Staff. According to his own memoirs, Zhukov protested, claiming he lacked the experience. But Stalin's decision was final. The peasant's son, the cavalryman, the tank commander, now stood near the top of the largest army on earth. He was the hammer, waiting for the anvil. The German Wehrmacht would soon learn what it felt like to be that anvil. When Operation Barbarossa rolled across the Soviet border in June 1941, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. But their first real introduction to the Zhukov effect was born of sheer desperation. By October 1941, with German forces closing in, Moscow was in a panic. In this moment of crisis, Stalin summoned the one man he believed could save the city. Zhukov was given command of the Western Front and tasked with defending the capital to the last dot. Zhukov arrived and imposed his iron will. He relentlessly enforced Stalin's draconian policies, like Order No. 270, which demanded no retreat and threatened any commander who abandoned his post with execution. He was everywhere, inspecting defenses, berating commanders, and demanding the impossible. He scraped together every available unit: Siberian divisions, militia battalions, even cadets, and threw them into the meat grinder. The German soldiers, exhausted and overextended, suddenly found the collapsing front turning to steel. Then, in early December, as the German offensive froze in the snows outside Moscow, Zhukov unleashed his reserves in a massive counterattack that stunned Army Group Center. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht wasn't just stopped, it was thrown back, reeling for over 100 miles in some sectors. The myth of German invincibility died in the snow, and the legend of Zhukov began. If Moscow was the start of the legend, Stalingrad was its confirmation. In autumn 1942, the German Sixth Army was deep inside the city, grinding the defenders down in brutal street fighting. The situation was grim. As Deputy Supreme Commander Zhukov was sent to handle the crisis, his solution was audacious. While the world watched the inferno inside the city, Zhukov and Marshal Vasilevsky gathered over 1 million Soviet soldiers on the weakly held flanks of the Sixth Army, flanks guarded by less equipped Romanian and Italian troops. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus was unleashed. In a massive pincer movement, Soviet fronts smashed through the Romanian and Italian lines. For the German soldiers of the Sixth Army, The news was a shock. The enemy was suddenly behind them. In just 4 days, the pincers met, and the trap snapped shut. Around 300,000 Axis soldiers were encircled. The feeling of superiority the German soldier had carried for years evaporated into dread. The name Zhukov was now tied to a horrifying new reality, the Kessel, or cauldron. It meant being cut off, starved, frozen, and ultimately annihilated. No campaign cemented Zhukov's reputation for sheer ruthlessness more than the battles of Rzhev from 1942 to 1943. Zhukov and other commanders directed a series of massive offensives against the Rzhev salient, a bulge in the German lines pointing toward Moscow. This became known to soldiers on both sides as the Rzhev meat grinder. Here, German troops were dug into heavy fortifications. Against these positions, Zhukov hurled wave after wave of Soviet infantry. The attacks were often frontal and conducted with what seemed to be a complete disregard for casualties. German machine gunners would later describe seeing lines of Soviet soldiers charge across open snowfields, only to be cut down. Then seeing a second wave rise and charge over the bodies of the first. Soviet losses in the fight for the Rzhev salient were astronomical, with estimates exceeding 1 million casualties. From the German perspective, this wasn't war. It was madness. And the stories that came back from the front were chilling. Whispers spread of a general who would sacrifice 10 of his own men to kill one of theirs. Horrifying tales, likely born from battlefield rumor, even claimed he used penal battalions to clear minefields simply by marching them through. Whether these specific stories were true is almost irrelevant. They were believed. The name Zhukov no longer just meant defeat. It meant a meaningless death ground into the mud by a commander who saw his own soldiers as another resource. As expendable as bullets, the final act of the Zhukov doctrine came at the gates of Berlin, the Battle of the Seelow Heights in April 1945. These heights were the last major defensive line before the capital. Commanding the First Belarusian Front, Zhukov was in a race with Marshal Georgy to be the one to take Berlin. He chose the most direct approach, a massive frontal assault. On April 16th, Zhukov opened with one of history's most intense artillery bombardments. Over 9,000 guns and rocket launchers turned night into a terrifying dawn. Then, he ordered 143 anti-aircraft searchlights turned on, hoping to blind the German defenders. To the soldiers in their bunkers, it was like the gates of hell had opened. What followed was 4 days of butchery. The initial assault bogged down, and the Soviet infantry and tanks became targets for well-positioned German artillery. Enraged, Zhukov ordered his commanders to push forward, regardless of the cost. He threw his tank armies into the fray, compounding the slaughter. But for every Soviet tank the Germans knocked out, more seemed to appear. They were fighting men. Zhukov was fighting with mathematics. By April 19th, the German defenses broke. The road to Berlin was open. The battle had been won at a staggering cost in Soviet lives, but it was won. It was the ultimate personification of the Zhukov they feared, a commander who would unleash the full, terrifying power of the Soviet war machine to simply erase anything in his path. The terror Zhukov inspired wasn't just a product of his battlefield record. It was amplified and twisted into something mythic by an unlikely source, the German propaganda machine itself. In the early days of the war, Goebbels's ministry portrayed the Soviet enemy as a Judeo-Bolshevik mass, unintelligent, cowardly, and poorly led. But as the Red Army began to throw the Wehrmacht back, that narrative started to fall apart. The German high command needed an explanation. How could the master race be defeated by those they deemed inferior? So they shifted tactics. Nazi propaganda began to paint Soviet leaders as monstrous Asiatic butchers who cared nothing for human life. The goal was to dehumanize them, but propaganda is a double-edged sword. Inadvertently, they created a legend. By portraying the Soviet command as willing to accept astronomical casualties, they confirmed the very thing soldiers were whispering in the trenches. The propaganda said the enemy was led by butchers. The soldier who survived the Rzhev meat grinder knew this to be true. Goebbels had given a name and a face to the German soldiers' deepest fears. He had created a demigod of destruction. This official propaganda was magnified 1,000 times by the unofficial rumor mill of the front line. The dread was so palpable that stories circulated among the troops. When a division was moved, the question wasn't just about the enemy's strength, but who was leading it. If the answer was Zhukov, it was cause for despair. His name became a weapon that did its work before a shot was ever fired. It signaled that a massive offensive was coming. It meant the enemy would have overwhelming superiority. And most terrifyingly, it meant the enemy commander had a single, unbending will to victory and would sacrifice anything and anyone to get it. This mythologizing reached its peak in the final year of the war. As the Red Army pushed into Germany, the fear of Zhukov merged with the terror of Soviet retribution. He became the leader of the avenging horde, the man whose speeches, part of a broader Soviet effort, promised to exact revenge for the suffering the Wehrmacht had inflicted. He was no longer just a general. He was the instrument of Germany's damnation, a figure of almost biblical terror. The whispers of the Wehrmacht, stoked by their own leaders, had helped create a monster in their minds, a monster whose power felt every bit as real as the T-34 tanks that bore his red star. In the final calculus of war, fear is a weapon, and on the Eastern Front, few wielded it more effectively than Georgy Zhukov. The fear he inspired was unique. It was a deeper, more existential dread. It was the fear of being rendered utterly insignificant. To face Zhukov was to face the terrifying logic of total war. It was to understand that your life, your training, and your courage were just variables in a cold, brutal equation he was prepared to solve with overwhelming numbers. The German soldier was often trained in a tradition of tactical finesse. Zhukov came to represent its antithesis, the war of annihilation. He didn't seek to outmaneuver you. He sought to crush you under a mountain of steel and flesh. The terror was a perfect storm. First, there was the undeniable reality of his command. His name was tied to Germany's most catastrophic defeats. Second, there was the self-inflicted wound of German propaganda, which accidentally made him the face of the inhuman monster they had invented. And third, there were the soldiers' own whispers, the stories from the front that turned the myth into a perceived reality. In the end, the German soldiers on the Eastern Front faced death in 1,000 forms. But the fear of Zhukov was different. It was the fear of inevitability, the terror of a calculated, relentless, and overwhelming erasure. It was the fear of a man who, through his iron will and utter ruthlessness, had become a human extension of the vast, unforgiving Russian steppe. He became more than a general. He became a symbol of Germany's doom. Georgy Zhukov's reputation for inspiring terror is legendary. But he's not the only commander in history to have had such a profound psychological impact on his enemies. What other generals in history commanded this level of fear? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.